Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Cuba Before the Revolution by the Cold War. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. Please consider heading over to the Cold War and showing them a little love and support if you like what you see here. Alright, it's been a while since we talked about the Cold War in any depth, or the Caribbean, or anything like that. So I thought we'd circle back to this. We have covered the Cuban Missile Crisis in the past, and we have looked at the Cold War channel before, specifically in relation to the week that we dived deeply into the atomic age and themes along the lines of nuclear accidents or disasters. So I just thought it'd kind of interesting to learn a little bit more about Cuba before it really got into the revolution and became communist Cuba, and then we get into events like we've already talked about, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, I thought we'd take a look at Cuba before the revolution. The Cold War does have one on the Cuban Revolution itself. If folks like this one, let me know. If you'd like to see part 2, well, the sequel, if you will, the actual Cuban Revolution, I'd be more than happy to do that. But I'd like to see what you guys think first. If you want it, we'll get into that. But I think it'd be interesting to learn a little bit about what Cuba was like before the revolution and how this tense relationship between Cuba and the United States developed, because the seeds of that were being laid long before the revolution. We've got a very interesting history with Cuba. So let's take a look and let's see what they got to tell us about that.
Cuba, to this day, remains a name many people rightly associate with the Cold War. It was undoubtedly a point of concern for the United States that a communist, Soviet-aligned state insisted on merely existing just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. But the communist revolution in Cuba also came as a shock because, before the revolution itself, Cuba was close to the United States both economically and culturally. But
I wouldn't even say close economically. They were very tightly tied to the United States economically. But I'm sure he'll get into that, so I'm not going to spend time talking about it here. If he doesn't cover what I'm thinking about, we'll talk about it later.
Not all was as rosy on the island as portrayed by I Love Lucy. Cuba was a colony in all but name, with economic exploitation, rampant crime, and substantial economic and social inequality. I'm your host David, and today we're going to look under the hood at Cuba on the eve of revolution, and what factors in this society really pushed its people to overthrow their capitalist rulers. This is the Cold War.
All right. Yeah, I should mention this is associated with Kings and Generals. Great channel, so I expect to see decent stuff from the Cold War as well, or good stuff.
Today, most Americans can't go to Cuba because of a travel embargo put in place after the revolution.
That's mostly true, but needs a little nuance. You can't go there for simple tourism. That is definitely not allowed. Obama tried to relax some of those restrictions, but they were put right back in place as soon as he left office. But you can go there for other reasons. Educational reasons, for example. There are ways to get Americans can visit Cuba. So don't get the idea that it's a complete blacklist. But simple tourism, yeah, no longer allowed.
However, for most everyone else, it's still a popular tourist destination, especially for people like myself here in Canada. Touring the island, you see a lot of relics of Cuba's complicated history of being a subject of Washington. On the eve of the revolution, Cuba was thoroughly under the thumb of the US.
Yeah.
Before the late 19th century, Cuba was a Spanish colony, but beginning in 1868, Cubans began a revolt against their European rulers. Over 10 years, this struggle gained the Cubans much sympathy and support from the Americans, who clandestinely smuggled people and weapons into the island, despite official US neutrality.
Okay, so that's kind of important to understand. We did support this early Cuban Revolution, but it was done not by the government. We were officially neutral, but we did have people sneaking into the country to help support the Cuban rebels, and we did have people supplying them and supporting the revolution.
In spite of this, the Spanish did win the war, but they conceded to the Cubans a greater degree of economic and political independence than they had before. With this more liberalized economy, the US built a love affair with the Cuban people. They were happy to buy almost the entirety of Cuba's exports. Relations also improved as rich and famous Americans began to buy vacation homes on the island.
One thing I'll say here is that even before this period, there was a lot of interest in Cuba by the United States. 1848, I think, we actually made an offer to Spain to buy Cuba. And then again in the 1850s, I want to say 56, but I could be off there, we made another effort to buy Cuba. So the United States had been interested in obtaining Cuba for quite a while.
After the revolt, Cuba's economy was in dire straits, and American investors poured money into the island, buying up businesses, industries, and properties at rock-bottom prices. What this resulted in was an island that, while a colony of Spain, was heavily integrated into the American economy. Americans now owned many businesses and homes in Cuba, and Cuban exports went almost entirely to the US. The Spanish
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. Most of their exports were going to the U.S. from, I want to say, the mid-1850s all the way up until the 1900s at least. Sugar exports, most of it was coming over here. They were becoming increasingly dependent on trade with the United States.
had
Which makes
won,
sense.
but their hold on Cuba was slipping. Soon, seeing both the economic and also the strategic importance of Cuba, the US began long-term plans to annex the island. After rising tensions in Cuba spilled over into the Second War of Independence in 1897, the US offered to buy Cuba from the Spanish, but the offer was refused.
Yeah, and that's at least the third time. There were at least two others that I'm aware of. I want to say, no, Grant wanted the Dominican Republic, I think. I don't remember if he actually tried to get Cuba too, but he went after Dominican.
The rejection, coupled with a very convenient, albeit accidental, explosion of the USS Maine, prompted Washington to declare war on Spain, a little conflagration known as the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, so in case you're not aware, especially if you're not American, there was a ship called the Maine. It was anchored in Havana Harbor, I believe, and it exploded. Now, the Americans blamed the Spanish. There have been rumors that the Spanish did it. There have been rumors that the Americans did it themselves in order to have a justification for war. The general consensus these days is that it was probably just an accident, but the Americans capitalized on it. This was a period of men like William Randolph Hearst, who was a media magnate, who was always famously looking for the next big story. And when this happens, he and some of his competitors take this story, run with it, and basically create this idea that Spain has attacked the United States and that we need to avenge the Maine. So that leads us into the Spanish-American War. In fact, supposedly, Hearst famously said, when a reporter went down to Cuba and saw that there was no fighting going on and reported back to Hearst that there is no war, Hearst ordered him to return and said, "You provide the stories, I'll provide the war." I don't know if that actually happened or if that's anecdotal. I should know, but if I ever verified that, I don't remember. But it gives you an idea of what really was kind of going on at this time and how some of these powerful media companies were manipulating events to sell more papers. And we think nowadays of the idea of fake news and problems with news agency kind of getting out of control, going after the clickbaits. That's always been a thing. The only thing that's really different now is that because news has become 24/7. We're getting a lot more exposure to it, and to fill that time when things aren't actually happening, they bring on talking heads that give opinions, and a lot of people can't separate opinion from fact, and yeah, it escalates. But the idea of fake news, or yellow journalism as it used to be called, tabloid journalism, is nothing new. It's been around forever.
The war was a short and decisive victory for the US, and Cuba received its independence in the Treaty of Paris late the next year. This was fully realized in 1902 when the US military occupation ended, except of course for, Guantanamo Bay, which the US reserved for use as a naval base and eventually extraterritorial prison.
Right.
Despite Cuba being independent, the US often intervened in Cuban politics thanks to the Platt Amendment, using the military to launch multiple interventions and occupations before the revolution.
They did do that several times, in fact.
The military and political domination of Cuba was strong, but running even deeper than that was the economic control, which grew even more profound. By 1926, 60% of Cuba's sugar production belonged to American companies, meaning profits left the country to line American pockets instead of further developing Cuba. 95% of sugar exports went to the US, making Cuba hopelessly dependent on American markets, and also afraid to anger them as a result.
That is mostly true. The numbers that he gave, I think, are slightly exaggerated, probably just rounded up to the nearest multiple of 10. I think it was more like 85 to 88% rather than 90. But it gives you the general idea. It doesn't need to be exact. The general idea is accurate enough.
Any trade sanction would obliterate the Cuban economy. Real estate companies began to pop up, and American socialites and elites bought Cuban homes in droves.
Yep.
So all of this is a preamble to what Cuba was at the dawn of the revolution, America's playground. It was a sort of Las Vegas before Las Vegas was, Las Vegas.
Right.
By the 1920s, the tourism boom spurred a rise in casinos, which really took off by the 1950s. The Batista government helped invest in the construction of luxurious hotels with casinos inside them. But who built these casinos and lined their pockets? Well, the funders of the gambling industry were a small contingent of Cuban elites, state banks, American union funds, and famously, the American mafia.
Right.
Mafia owners would skim profits.
I was going to say there's no way the American mafia wasn't in there.
Cheat investors, and traffic large amounts of drugs to the island in order to make it the perfect den of sin. All part of a nice getaway, if that's your thing. Now, this corruption all happened without regard for the Cuban people. Very few Cubans, and most of them white and wealthy, could afford to stay in these beautiful hotels, or gamble in those flashy casinos, or take those fun drugs. The only way the vast majority of Cubans were going to enter a casino was by wearing a uniform and, shuffling cards.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what it would feel like to be a working class Cuban. You'd see these beautiful casinos, places of luxury set aside for foreign tourists. They were a living monument to American domination and the stark inequalities of the country. It's not surprising that these casinos were high up on the looting targets by future revolutionaries. Of course, despite the casinos, Cubans had many more important reasons to be angry with Batista's regime, specifically the torture and murder, but still, the casinos were a highly visible symbol of the excessive corruption of his government. So there's a common idea, though, that moral outrage against the casinos, criminals, and debauchery is what motivated people like Fidel Castro to overthrow the regime. However, a growing body of research seems to show that this is actually a massive exaggeration. The story of mafiosos and crooked casinos were sensationalized and their role in Cuban society overrepresented. For example, the gambling industry, even at its peak, never broke 10% of the profits of their gargantuan sugar industry.
Right.
The Cuban revolutionaries instead were angry about the dictatorship of the Batista regime. Public officials were wildly corrupt, the US was growing ever more imperialistic, and there was massive economic inequality. Rural poverty in Cuba was severe, and there was extreme unemployment, especially amongst young people. As anyone who has listened to a few seasons of Revolutions with Mike Duncan could tell you, this was a recipe for revolution. If you look at the kinds of issues people like Castro spoke out about, it was about the tyranny of landlords, the need for land reform for the peasant class, and democracy in the workplace. The revolutionaries wanted to nationalize industries like electricity and telephone lines into public services, since at the time they were owned by American companies. As well, Cuba had an entrenched racial caste system, which the revolutionaries opposed. White Cubans still held much of the power, while a subjugated black working class struggled to survive, often as landless peasants on massive agricultural plantations owned by American businesses. Now, Cuba was a one-crop economy. This fact meant that farmland for commodities needed for domestic consumption, things like food, was sidelined to make sugar.
Yeah, and that is not uncommon in many parts of the world. And that is one reason why you sometimes have serious issues when something goes wrong with the economy in some of these situations. Cuba came to rely heavily on their sugar industry. And to make that worse, they were relying on one single export destination, the United States. Yes, there were others, but up almost 90% of it was coming over here. When you have 90% of what you're making is one item, and 90% of that's going to one place, that's just a recipe for disaster. If anything goes wrong in a relationship between the countries, or something hits that crop, for example, or any other of a wide variety of things. But more importantly, typically what happened is you start out especially in colonial systems, you'll start out with an attempt to get rich. Often that fails. Then you have a wave of farmers come in that are going to grow subsistence crops so that you can survive. But then you start to drift back towards the cash crops. Jamestown would be a good example. They came looking for gold. They nearly all died out. They brought in some farmers. Those farmers started growing food. And then they did the headright system. You start getting the tobacco plantations coming up. Those tobacco plantations, because they're dealing with cash crops, are becoming wealthier. They're starting to buy up all the land from the farmers that are growing the food, which shrinks food production way back down again and makes you vulnerable again. Same thing's happening here in Cuba. Something similar to this happens in China, in certain parts of China with the silk industry, where farmers were switching from growing food to survive to producing trees for silkworms in order to get rich. And then you start having famine-related issues because nobody's growing food anymore. You're suddenly become dependent on importing that food, and if anything disrupts that, you're in trouble. So this is kind of a dangerous situation, especially when you're talking about cash crops, because cash crops are kind of like weeds in a way. They tend to overrun necessary foods being produced because everybody wants to get rich, right? They want to make money in a capitalist society. And you can make a lot more money with sugar than you can growing beans and barley to feed your family. If you grow enough sugar, then you can buy the food to feed your family and you don't need to grow it yourself. And that worked great until something happened to cut you off from your income. For example, the price of sugar goes down, or you lose your trading partner, or too much competition drives the prices up, things like that. So this is just a recipe for disaster, and this has happened all through history. This is nothing new at all.
A cash crop for American businesses. This situation drove up food prices and made the poor even poorer. Around 80% of farmable land belonged to large landowners who only cared about making sugar, and 25% of the country's best farmland belonged to U.S. monopolies. Most Cubans couldn't afford to go to any school, and in rural areas, electricity and running water were rare. Half of rural Cubans, or about a quarter of the whole population, were illiterate. It was a period of severe economic struggle.
Yeah, so when he gave two different numbers for the illiterate, he was talking about the overall population being about 25% illiterate, but the rural population specifically, that subset, was around 50. Again, those numbers are rounded up a bit. I don't think they were quite that high, but they were close enough. That's a pretty good approximation.
While you could see Batista and his corrupt government officials hobnobbing with wealthy American tourists in those luxurious casinos. The situation was almost a perfect case for a working people's revolution, and as we know, that's precisely what was about to occur. This video is far from our last about Cuba. The revolution itself and the reconstruction of Cuba after the revolution is a long and winding tale. Plus, I think there was a crisis involving missiles of some kind,
yeah.
which we actually might need to mention at some point. Cuban revolutionaries saw their country for what it was, a place where a few enjoyed lives of luxury, while at the same time the vast majority of the population struggled to survive. Over and over again in history, this has been the fertile soil where revolutions are born. And as we all know, Cuba was no exception. Where Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries would take things, well, that's the topic for future videos. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have exploited the bell button. We can also be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV.
All right, so I guess we're done. So I hope you guys liked that. If you'd like to see some follow-up on this with the Cuban Revolution itself, and he mentioned they might have one on Reconstruction. I didn't see that when I was looking through, but if that's something you'd be interested in, then let me know, and maybe in a week or two down the line, we'll go ahead and do those as well. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I hope you guys all learned something, and I'll see you all again next time. Until then, bye-bye.